Dan Curts, great to finally have you on the Single Track podcast.
Yeah, Finn, thank you very much. I'm excited to be on here.
We were talking offline. I think in the last 4 or 5 months alone, we've had 5 or 6 fairly long phone conversations and got a good group chat going with a mutual friend, Jack Kenzel. And I think they've been fairly substantial conversations, not just about like your own athletic career, but just general curiosity about where the sport's headed and all the nuts and bolts of the athlete-sponsor relationship, stuff like that. I have a whole list of things I want to cover in this episode. I'm sure we'll get to a lot of it, but just to set the table for any folks that aren't familiar with you, can you give like an elevator pitch about like what your specialty is in the trail and ultra running scene and how you got into it?
Well, Finn, yeah, thanks for having me on. Like you said, I think it's been a little while in the making now, but as far as my specialty in the trail world goes, I'm not sure I have one yet, or I don't know what it is. Yeah, little elevator pitch. I guess I come from a more classic running background. Middle school, high school, college, ran on the track, did road races, I guess, when I was little, just being bored on the weekend. And then, had good success throughout, full ride to college for track, and had success to Division I level in college. And then, finding my footing post-collegiately and through COVID, basically this spring said, I really want to race some trail stuff, really want to race some mountain stuff. I think it's just more true to myself. And yeah, so this spring kind of just dove headlong into this and ran a couple trail races, and all of a sudden it went pretty well. And then I found myself kind of, going overseas and doing some races a little haphazardly. And that's kind of where I'm at now.
That's awesome. One of the reasons why I wanted to have you on the show, I'm actually going to reference a conversation I had back in November of 2021. And it actually might have been a conversation that brought us together, or maybe I reached out to you, you reached out to me. It was with Sam Parsons from Tin Man Elite. Mm-hmm. And I asked Sam at some point in the episode, given your position in the road and the track world, looking from the outside into the trail world, what are some stories that you think need to be better told in our sport? And one of the first things that came to mind for him was telling the story of the quote unquote disaffected, talented collegiate runner that, had all of this talent, all of this promise in those 4 years, maybe lived up to it to some degree, but for whatever reason, kind of like lost their passion or lost their way in that area, and has gone to the trail and ultra world for revival. And there are a lot of people that fit that mold. I'm not saying that that's you to a T, but like, I feel like you have some of that. So I do want to set the table for that conversation in a minute. Going back a little bit though, we had a conversation back in September and you talked about your origins in running. You mentioned how in high school you quickly learned that running was going to be your ticket to college. And when I think about that, like no matter which way I slice it or dice it, that's a lot of pressure. Can you talk about the way you handled it? Like did that realization that like running was going to count for a lot, did that make you love running more? Did it make you hate it? Like what was your response in that situation?
So not to push back on it, but maybe just a correction. Honestly, it was middle school. It was 7th grade. Like I remember having this conversation in the middle of the winter, like one night walking my dog with my mom. And yeah, it was basically this understanding that maybe there weren't a ton of options of, what to do down the road, I guess. And it seemingly the best one was running. My uncle was my high school coach. He's a great guy, unbelievable guy. That's a long conversation though anyway. And he had coached a handful of guys, from like the late 90s into the 2000s who were really good. And so like Louis Lucchini ends up being an 11-time All-American.
Legend.
at Stanford, yeah, like super good guy. He's on the team with Ryan Hall and like this crazy team at Stanford, like the second lowest scoring cross country team in NCAA history. And basically there was this like path that we could see that was kind of, you run well enough in high school and you open up a lot of doors for yourself. And those are exciting doors to open because it's like, you can go most places in the country and it's kind of like a thing that pays for itself, hopefully. And so, yeah, I mean, that was in 7th grade. And I remember, just talking about goals for the next cross country season. And it's in middle school cross country in Maine, in rural Maine too. And yeah, it just set everything up. And like you talked about pressure with it, I don't know. It was more like exciting than like pressure. It was like, this is so cool. You could do so much with it. And like, this is the thing I love doing the most. And like, obviously it's like development of a passion. And so at that point it wasn't like, this is all I care about. But it certainly grew that way. And yeah, it's just like, all right, let's kind of like take this thing a little seriously. Like, let's give a crap about this.
That's interesting that your gut instinct or your gut reaction is to reframe pressure as this exciting opportunity. Would you consider yourself to be a net optimist?
I don't know. I don't know if I would say that. And I don't know. Like, I don't think it was reframing of anything. I think that was just the framing. It was like, it's just exciting. I don't know. That's what it always was. It wasn't, there's a lot of pressure with it. And sure, there was a lot of pressure with it. And like, there were times you'd feel that, but it was also a fairly clear path. And whenever there was like struggle or, really tough things going on in family life, that was always this guiding light, for lack of a better term, I guess. Just huge grounding thing. I was always like, well, this is something that will always be there, hopefully. And obviously now I recognize that that's not true. Like, running won't always be there. Hopefully in some capacity it will, but that's not a given. So yeah, I don't think it was necessarily the same as this huge weighty pressure, and at least not all the time.
Well, I think, for the sake of this part of the conversation, you clearly between middle school and college worked extremely hard, had a ton of success. You punched your ticket. You got that full ride on a running scholarship. Was it Iowa State?
It was Iowa State. That's what it ended up being.
What was I know there's so much you could say about it, but as it applies to what led you to trail running, what was your college running experience like? Like, what were the pros, the cons? What did you like, dislike?
So, yeah, I feel like maybe grew up kind of like half feral. And like spent more time out in the woods than like inside for sure. Like my uncle, who's my coach, I lived at their house for a little while, and just a ton of property in like the woods down to the ocean, like unbelievable property. But my cousin and I were basically just convinced all the time, like we could easily live outside. And, a ton of the time we spent just being outside in the woods. And so that was all it was just running around. There's no trail. There's nothing like that. You're just like bombing through the bushwhacking and stuff. And I think that's really what running was for me. It wasn't necessarily the same as this hardcore sport. I think there was kind of like two sides to it there. Whereas like there's the sport aspect that's really kind of this button I need to press to like get to places. But the relationship with it, I think, was always this more, I don't know if holistic or what the right word would be, but it was different than the sport side. And so, yeah, then like growing up in Maine, I wasn't exposed to a lot of the really serious side of the sport. Like, I didn't realize there were kids in California running 100-mile weeks in high school. I didn't realize there were kids in Texas who had been, training that hard since 8th grade or whatever. And so getting to college, I mean, even on my recruiting visit, to Iowa State, I was on with a kid from Arizona, and he did a 20-mile long run on his recruiting trip. And that time, I don't know if I'd ever run more than, and I thought I was training pretty hard. I don't know if I'd ever run more than 10 or 11 miles at that time.
Wow.
Probably, no, that might not be true. It was probably closer to 12. And I thought that was like the longest run ever. And you just kind of get your head snapped back when you realize, like, whoa, this world is a lot different than I thought it was. So yeah, then, I'm running in Iowa, and it's definitely a lot more, less engaging running than I was used to. And that kind of shifted things. And obviously the competition side is the only piece that's going on there. So, yeah, maybe soured things. I think maybe it wasn't what running was to me totally anymore. And that was interesting for sure.
Do you feel like athletically you got everything out of yourself in those 4 years that you could have?
I would say definitely not. I had some successes where I'd be like, oh, that's a pretty good result. And this is before the last couple years where the NCAA, all the times have just gone crazy. But, I won a Big 12 championship in the 5,000. I had run a couple good 5Ks out at Stanford, in invitationals and stuff. And, but the training really wasn't super post-collegiately. I was trying to explain the training to the coach that I was working with after college, and he didn't believe me until I brought training logs in. It was super remedial, I guess might be a decent word for it. Not exactly super dialed in. Yeah, did not get everything out of myself athletically. I think that's a very fair characterization.
And what makes you want to, when you think about, graduating from Iowa State and finishing 4 years of hard training and racing, how do you explain the energy and the motivation to immediately pivot into trail and ultra? A lot of folks, there is that pipeline to joining teams like Hoka, Naz Elite and stuff like that. But, a lot of these runners, they retire after that. That's the end of their really hard training, hard racing days. Talk about where your mindset is when you want to get into trail and ultra, immediately after that.
Yeah. So I would say at some point during college, I started, I stumbled onto a Kilian Jornet video on YouTube, and you're like, whoa, this is pretty sweet. And kind of realize, I don't know, maybe my junior year of college, that there's this whole trail running thing and there's races. Had no idea of this, I think people growing up where the sport has been more established for a little while. And to be fair, I don't think I was really exposed to much of anything growing up that way. So yeah, probably junior year, I realized that, this trail racing thing's a thing. And I started watching, getting more and more into it, just from a fan perspective. That between that and some of these climbing docs and videos that start coming out, I'm like, man, this really seems to jive more with what I'm into. But that being said, then I end up graduating college and move out to Seattle, and I'm training with a pro group out there.
Oh, you were? Okay.
So I was out there for maybe 8 months before COVID hit. But
was this Brooks Beasts?
No, it was Brooks Beasts. It wasn't Brooks Beasts. They were in the same little neighborhood. But Andy Powell, who was the coach at Oregon forever with Ed Cheserek and that time period, he's over at the University of Seattle now. Great guy, love Powell. He had a couple of post-collegiates that were training under him. So Amos Bartelsmeyer, he's German national champ in the 1500. He's now part of Bowerman Track Club. Sam Prakel, he's run 350 in the mile. 13, 15, like 2 weekends ago in the 5,000. I was just out there training with them. Fell into it. Training was going well. Like training was going really well. I think it would be, like closing mile repeats and 4.0s, and it being great, like feeling great. So basically that winter we were like targeting this early season 5K at BU, and it was like super, super ready to rock. And training had been going great. Every workout was just like, geez. And go to Boston and it just doesn't click, and I just can't get that much out of myself. My heart just isn't super in it. So I ran like 13:38, which was a huge disappointment for 5,000. And basically that I end up sticking around that, and I hadn't really ever run a mile seriously. And so we basically were like, all right, well, like, let's just check off, running under 4 minutes, and ran under 4 minutes. And then had like that was like Friday night. Saturday, Sunday, I was supposed to have off and come back to practice. And I was like, oh man, I have the weekend off. Like I don't have any like training I have to go be doing. And so sitting in Seattle, like you're looking at the mountains, they're snowy. It's the end of February and Seattle's somehow just cloudy. It's like still 50s, and like, man, I need to go get in the snow. And so Saturday, Sunday, I ran like 4 hours in the snow. I think it's 3 hours the next Sunday, just messing around. And it's like, oh, that was so great. And I think looking back on that, it's really telling. Like I wasn't that pumped. I was like, who cares? Like everyone runs under 4 minutes. It doesn't really matter. Whereas, that is like a lifetime kind of achievement. It's the only thing that's really, everyone seems to understand, like, oh, that's a big thing. But really, I wanted to just go mess around in the mountains. So yeah, COVID hits, the group kind of is falling apart. We know Amos is going to Bowerman. Everyone kind of goes home. It's COVID. And I was like, I'd rather be back home in Maine during this than in Seattle. And then, move out and start training with Ben True out in New Hampshire and Vermont. And it still took me, quite a while to actually like jump in and do a trail race. And I think go ahead.
I didn't realize that you had spent that year or so with the Seattle-based pro group. That's very interesting. So you actually did give that world an honest try before. I mean, and we'll talk about Northwoods Athletics and Ben True in a second, but that's very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely, and there still is, which is interesting, but a lot of unfinished business on the track. I knew I never gave it a fair shake, and simply from a training perspective, and I knew mentally I was like not good in college. Just from a training perspective, I was like, there's so much on the table. So like, I have to just go back and, give a couple months of good training. And I had definitely gone to like the next level fitness wise, but to do anything at that level, I think requires so much mental and emotional energy as well as physical that I don't think my heart was in it enough. It just wasn't clicking. It wasn't, just wasn't there for me the same way. And I do wonder what happens if my, collegiate career had been different. Cause like I just watched, Sam and Amos ran 13:15 and 13:17 this past, or 2 weekends ago in Boston. And certainly during that build up, when I was out there, it certainly looked like I was in much better 5,000 shape at that point. And so it would have been awesome to try to be out there still and be training with them and run in that ballpark with them, because that would just be so cool. But just couldn't keep doing it, and so made this switch to the trails.
Well, the obvious question to me, given that you believe in yourself so much and you are certain there's unfinished business in that world, and at some point you see yourself going back in some capacity, why? What's motivating you to invest so much time in the trail world? Like, talk about where your mind's at when it comes to that.
So yeah, I would love to go back, and I mean, I would love to. So Louis Lucchini, to bring him up again, he had run 13:25, and so growing up, there was always like this super far off, like, and I had no idea what it means, but I had always known. I knew what he ran every year in high school. I knew what he ran, like his, lifetime PB, and it was always kind of like, I don't know, forever the password on my phone, I think it actually still is like, 13:24:99. So
watch out, the wrong people could be listening to this episode.
Yeah. And so yeah, I've always, and I haven't run that, and I would love to someday. I don't know now that if like I'm scratching the trail running itch too much, that it's hard to get back to that level on the track. But right now the motivation to do the trail stuff is like, it's really what I love. I think it's more actually what I am and who I am as a runner. I think, I think there's just so many cool aspects to it. It's so exciting to think like, Worlds next year's in Innsbruck. How much cooler is that than going and racing a 5K on the road in some major city in the US? I'm like, that doesn't sound that exciting. I've done that. Like, I've run the US champs in New York City on 5K on the road. It's cool. It's really cool. It's unique, but like, go race in Europe for 2 months in the mountains instead of on the track out there. You're like, seems pretty sweet.
Before we get into more full-fledged trail stuff,
yeah,
can you give a bit of an overview of Northwoods Athletics? And after that, I think we should talk about Ben True as well, because Ben True is, in the running world, obviously a household name, pride of Maine, pride of New England, but there might be some folks listening to this show that don't know him. So first start with Northwoods Athletics, but would love to talk about Ben after that.
Yeah, so Northwoods Athletics is a little pro team that we are, kind of hoping to get off the ground. I would say it's fairly fledgling right now. Right now it consists of Ben True. So Ben is typically competing between 10K and marathon. He's super established. We'll get more into him in a second. And then there's Eric Lipuma and myself, Eric.
Super strong
guy
Eric.
Who's been on the pod. Yeah.
He,
but we're all basically in this similar chunk of the country out here. Eric lives a little bit down the road, maybe like an hour or so. But basically it's built out of this belief that there's not many training groups in the country, right? If you want to be training with a group, the formula seems to be you move to Boulder or Flagstaff. And having trained in both of those places, both Ben and I, and Eric lived in Boulder for a while actually too. The training's just better here. I'd say like hands down. It doesn't have the altitude piece, but honestly, unless you're racing at altitude, I think that's a deep physiological conversation probably. But the training here is just unreal. The AT runs through town here between two tracks that both have public use. Good luck finding.
By the way, give your location. Give your location.
That's fair. So we're in the upper valley of Vermont and New Hampshire. So it's basically somewhat nebulous definition, but it's basically Hanover, New Hampshire. So, not a terribly populated section of the world, 2 hours north of Boston, out in the woods. And it's just rolling dirt roads everywhere. The Appalachian Trail crosses through. You've got the Whites to the east. You've got the Green Mountains of Vermont to the west. Super cool area. I love it out here. The other big piece of moving from Seattle for me was that I wanted to be closer to home, and Seattle didn't totally click for me. Yeah, I just didn't love it. I wasn't that blown away. I haven't really. I've trained in Flagstaff for about 6 months as well. And I would certainly much rather be out here training. So yeah, I think long-term, we would love it to be a destination for anybody looking to train at a high level, and whether that's focused for running a fast mile on the track, whether it's trying to run a super good ultra. We welcome all, and if anybody's interested in that, we're DMs are open.
It's an interesting mix of runners because Eric obviously was on that US 80K team at the World Champs, had a great performance there. I think he ran the 100K road World Champs as well. Mm-hmm. He's messed around at a lot of different ultra distances. You're in that sub ultra trail scene. Ben is in that 10K to marathon road scene. How do you make it work with such a medley of runners?
Well, really, a lot of training is pretty similar, right? You end up doing just a lot of running. Specific workouts, if Ben were to get ready for a 10K, he's, no knock on Eric, and I think Eric would be fine with me saying this. Like, Eric can't go do a 10K specific workout with Ben, There's only a couple people,
but not many people can.
So yeah, but really in more broadly, most of running is running, and you can just everyone can go do a 10-miler together on the dirt roads. And the hope is to have, personally, I think there's not much structure in the trail world. Like, this is a recurring topic on your podcast as well. But, how many actual training groups for the trail are there in the US? I can't really think of any. People, they call themselves, there's like a Solomon teams, like, well, who trains together? You'd have a hard time convincing me of that. And there 100% should be. And, where else is better than here? I think you've got, in the winter, great cross-country skiing, great access to uphill skiing as well. You've got all the dirt roads, you've got trails for days. Everywhere. There's a rail trail in my backyard right here. I think it covers everything you could need. And so I think that's basically the belief. Ben was part of Oregon Track Club for a little while, and he did this very similar story to what I did in Seattle. Not clicking, did not work for him. He had to move back home, came back here. He's been here since. Yeah, it's just a great training ground, and there should be more people training here.
Okay, I was going to save this for later in the episode, but I think I got to ask you it now. We got to talk about the East Coast, West Coast divide, because obviously you are somebody that is an aspiring, arguably current professional trail athlete in our sport. It's probably right at the forefront of your mind. Environment, like, how important is it to have supportive people around you, the best training conditions, applicable training conditions, etc. The list of people that were formerly rooted on the East Coast that have since uprooted and moved to places like Boulder, Flagstaff, Seattle, etc. is endless. Like, that story will recycle itself for years to come. You're making the argument for the East Coast. Talk about the pressures you feel, if any, to leave and go west, and more about like why you're still there today.
For sure. Yeah, like you said, you alluded to this. I think there's some amount of specificity, I think, required for some of the trail racing. I think you see that in this year Golden Trail Series. One of the races is in Norway, Strandafjord, and you have all these people from Colorado go out and, I don't know, I would say run pretty poorly. I think it's hard to train for those races where things are going to be wet and really rocky in most places in the US. Mm-hmm. I would say I think this is the prevailing kind of theme here, is that the trails here are hyper technical by most definitions out there. I think probably if you're out in Colorado, a lot of the stuff that we have out here is probably what it's like out at 13 or 14,000 feet. And so I think that lends itself to a certain kind of race. I think it certainly helps for some of the races out in Europe where things are steep and technical. Yeah, I think getting back to your point about how important is the culture stuff. Culture is huge, obviously. You
Huge.
want to be around people who are of the same mindset. And so that's where I'd maybe plug here again. Dartmouth is one of the, like, I just feel like the whole area is endurance focused.
Yep.
I think Norwich, Vermont, which is the other side of the river from Hanover, holds the distinction of the most Olympians per capita of like anywhere in the world.
That's a great stat.
It's pretty sweet. Everybody skis. Everybody skis. A lot of them are downhill skiers, to be fair.
Huge Nordic scene, though, too.
Huge Nordic scene. Dartmouth's hosting NCAAs, I believe, in 2025. So they're putting in a bunch of snowmaking on their Nordic trails, and lighting and a loop, like it's just a really cool environment for that stuff. That being said, there is some, like, I can totally see how it's super like sexy to go. There's so much of the industry based in, like, I feel like it's all Colorado and Utah. And part of that, I think, is a function of population. Just not a ton of people live out here. And so there is some draw to go out there for periods of time. And like, I have so many friends out there training. Like, yeah, it'd be sweet to go train with a bunch of people right now. But I also see this place for what I think it is. And it's like this little gem that I feel like if you polish, it could be something incredibly cool. But yeah, that's a tough thing to get off the ground. You've got to convince you got to get a couple like early adopters and say like, look, we really believe in this thing. Come on out, kind of thing, and join on, and let's see what we can do and see what we can build. But I think certain things, certainly, there's just so many people who I think for the last couple of years have shown that it does work to be here. I think Eric was one of the very few people who actually ran really well at Broken Arrow who aren't from altitude, who isn't
Great
from altitude.
point.
I mean, he was second, closing pretty hard on first in the 52K out there. And he had there was no altitude acclimation. I think Jack Kenzel has been someone who might be in that conversation where he's done, I feel like he's really cut his teeth out here. Jeff Colt's another guy. Jeff Colt is from right over here. He's from right here. There's a bunch of people. It's interesting. Noah Williams, he was on the 40K team in Thailand. I've been working for his mom this past year, like coaching this group of like middle schoolers for running stuff. There's so many people. Katie Scheid is, wins UTMB. She does she grew up in the, White Mountains. There's just a lot of people who I think there's something about it. There's like, maybe it's culture. I don't know what it is.
You know what? And you just made me think this. I feel like going to Flagstaff or Salt Lake City or Boulder, Portland, etc., that is the ultra running equivalent of like joining some big established corporation in business, like going to work for Google or Facebook or Twitter, etc. Whereas in your case, like rooting down in Vermont and really investing in the fruits of your labor, that is the ultra running equivalent of entrepreneurship. There isn't much of a trail running scene there, at least in terms of like this established elite scene. Like you, Ben, and Eric is an incredible core. And it could be the case that you'll never truly get to experience the fruits of your labor, but there is something to be said about like laying down roots, like being entrepreneurial when it comes to starting a running community, and hopefully seeing it pay off in like generations to come.
So it's interesting. The number of like local crushers, I feel like I host a group run on the weekends we do through Northwoods, and like, the dirt road we ran up this past weekend, we host it from this coffee shop. It's on this dirt road. It's pretty sweet. The dirt road climbs up, turns to what's called a class 4, which is like an unmaintained section of road, which varies from passable by minivan to like hiking trail. It's really interesting, but public right away. So you could try to bring your minivan through there if you wanted, but good luck. We climbed 900 feet on this dirt road in the first 2 miles of this run last weekend. And none of the people there are complaining. Just like community, like people from the community climb up. We actually cross the Appalachian Trail on that run as well and come back down. And like hilly, brutal run by most means. And nobody complains. I feel like everybody here does it all. And so maybe this blends into, I think, what we were probably going to get into later in the podcast, with it's just like industry and sponsorship stuff. But just makes no sense to me, some of the stuff, because everybody here runs trails. There's a right over here, Boston lot. It's got like 50 or 60 miles of trails. Like everybody goes in there, walks their dog, runs with their dog. It's not, I feel like the lines are more blurred here as well. Like I feel like a lot of people are like, I'm a trail runner, I'm a road runner, like, all this. You're like, everybody does everything. Everybody here has a gravel bike, a road bike, a mountain bike. Everybody here has, their Nordic skis, their uphill setup, their backcountry setup. And maybe that's true of many outdoorsy places, but I feel like everything really blends together here. And even run within the same run, a lot of people will do this mix of like technical trail to like road back to their house to, dirt road. It is interesting. And I think that's probably the cool part of the scene here, where it's like everybody's into it. And it's the elite aspect that isn't there, maybe. The like high end elite, like there's a lot of like local crushers, but
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's just to hammer in on that elite conversation, that's one of the central questions we've been asking, is like, what factors are required to encourage it or entice more people like yourself to come to a certain area to base their training, and not even just to base their training, but like to also invest in the race scene too, like to determine that like, okay, like X, Y, and Z races in this region matter to me, and that's where I'm going to plan a lot of my race schedule. Like I feel like not only are we missing the elite culture on the Northeast, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, we're missing the elite culture, and then also elite investment in said races as well.
Maybe I'd push back a hint on that. I just feel like some of the stuff is kind of underdeveloped, and part of that is a fault of the industry, in my opinion, because I think for some reason a lot of the team managers are unwilling to maybe invest out here, and I'm not sure totally why that is. I know that this past year I felt like the easiest way for me to get a contract, just move to Boulder for 3 months, be buddy with people, be like, you're a little more seen out there. It feels like everybody out there is an ambassador or sponsored athlete of some sort. And not to discredit that, but I feel like, and I think I can speak for Eric a little bit on this. I think both him and I have found it a bit difficult to kind of like break into that, despite, if you look at maybe others within that sphere, I think it's like maybe probably deserving of like, some support. It is interesting. It seems like a lot of the industry. Go ahead.
Oh no, I was just to give Eric a quick shout out, because I think he more than deserves it. I think he's one of the top free agent ultra runners heading into 2023. I think that if you look at what he did at Black Canyon, what he did at Worlds, and then just his entire body of work with like 50K stuff, etc. I think
he's super versatile too. He can drop down and run like a good like 10K distance mountain race. Yep. He was 7th at Worlds, right?
Yep. 7th at Worlds.
7th at 80K. 2nd at Broken Arrow. If you go through the list at Broken Arrow, he beat a lot of guys with contracts, that's for sure. And I don't think I think there was times when, people maybe should have been answering more emails from him.
He beat some pros. He beat some ambassadors. He beat some ambassadors that think that they're pros.
Yeah.
Beat a lot of, yeah.
So I don't know what the word totally is. Maybe it feels like the industry is like vaguely incestuous out there. I think like some of it's like, and maybe people don't have the knowledge to step back and like look at things holistically, but you're like, from an X's and O's perspective, you're like, the Northeast is close to huge population centers, right? If you're just looking in terms of exposure, the oldest like hiking path in the country is in New Hampshire, Crawford Notch, right? Crawford Path. Everybody comes up from Boston, everybody comes up from New York City. Like, there's a ton of these people who come up and get out here, and having visibility for those brands at that upper level is huge. Like, why would you not want that out here? Like, it seems like you're just watering down the whole scene out west. You're like, you already have 3 pro athletes in the same town that all go get like hang out together all the time. You're like, it has to be somewhat diminishing returns.
Dude, the East Coast is so metal. I want to come back now.
Come on out, dude. You can be part of Northwoods Athletics. You're welcome.
Well, and again, I mean, we've talked about this theme ad nauseum, the idea of like building a trail running team or just building a running team in general. What have been some of the most interesting lessons or takeaways you've had from the process of, like, for example, trying to recruit new athletes to the team, or maybe it could be branding related, or just trying to get your name out there with sponsors? Like, what have been some of the interesting takeaways for you?
Yeah. Well, first off, I'd like to say, like, I'm not trying to bash on Colorado or Utah. Like, obviously
I'm a Utah guy. I take it in stride. Bring it on.
Well, you're a Maine guy, you just live in Utah. I'd say, like, obviously they're destinations for a reason. They're great. There's a ton of options of stuff. I think maybe my perspective is a little more of like, there's a ton of sweet overlooked stuff here. And I think part of that is like this Instagram effect. I think there's a lot of just visibility for, like, Colorado, Utah, for those reasons. And so maybe this isn't like the place that people jump to when they're thinking of, destinations for this kind of thing. But yeah, I think that's a mistake. It's interesting.
And this is, I don't know why I'm thinking of this right now, but I thru hiked the Appalachian Trail back in 2014. And one of the most interesting phenomenons that I came across was like down south, like Georgia, North Carolina, Virginia, all of the local communities that were like directly embedded in those mountains, they were super invested in the trail. Like, all of these church groups would come out, all of these civic groups would come out. They would set up like tables and chairs for through hikers at road crossing. They'd cook you burgers. They'd like take you home to their houses where you could like shower and sleep. As soon as I crossed the Mason-Dixon line into like Maryland, New York, Pennsylvania, etc., the Northeast, I was surprised at how almost all of that vanished in an instant, and there was less community and excitement, like communal excitement around the mountains, and like people wanting to share what was there with outsiders. Like, there was this, and it could have just been a moment in time and me walking through, but I saw that time after time, especially as I was walking through the Northeast. So part of me wonders, like, in the same way that a lot of people go out west to pursue individualism, is there some weird pockets of like individualism and like go at it your own in the Northeast mountains? And I haven't quite figured it out, but I only say that to just bring up a contrast that I noticed between like even just the Southeast and the Northeast. That was very interesting.
Yeah. I mean,
could be totally wrong.
I might push back a little on it. Like, I mean, I know my neighbor this past, summer, I guess, had a bunch of northbound AT hikers over to his house. 'Cause just, I don't know, it was actually weird. Like, I was at this pizza place with a buddy, and then like my neighbor was also there, and we both kind of, from opposite sides of the, like, outside where we were eating, started talking to these like through hikers, and he invited them all back to his house. He's like, "Oh yeah, come stay at my place," and like invited a bunch of them back. And so we all just like had a bonfire, hung out, talked about the trail. And so maybe that's true in pockets. I'm not sure. I have no AT knowledge, just having run stuff around here. But that is an interesting thing. I think there is it is just interesting. Like, I feel like a lot of the trails out here are I don't know, maybe like taken for granted by people. I don't know. I'm not sure what it is.
And I was so dumbfounded by, or I shouldn't say dumbfounded, but I was I was confused by it because I feel like New England has this reputation of like the town hall culture where, you know, civic engagement and participation in the community is so important. Like, you know, a lot of the foundations of like our government and democracy and stuff like were birthed there in New England, and to see it not extended in my experience to trail culture was very interesting. And again, it could just be an isolated incident shot in the dark, but I've always been trying to theorize why there isn't as much marketed community in the Northeast as there is out West. I don't know.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure what it would be like in relation to the. I could see maybe a lot of. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure what it would be,
especially in Maine. I feel like the main the main section of the Appalachian Trail, which is very remote to begin with.
How many towns do you go through on the main AT though? Like,
yeah, you go through like Andover,
yeah,
Rangeley,
yeah,
Caratunk,
yeah,
like this like small section of Millinocket. It's
how many. I might push back, and maybe a lot of that stuff might be socioeconomic. I would argue that certainly those main towns are pretty tired. Like they're not, they're definitely impoverished areas and like not a lot of money, not a lot going on that way. And I have a bunch of friends who, you know, growing up in rural Maine, like friends in town who've never been to Acadia National Park. Like we're 20 minutes from the park, and like we're juniors in high school, and yeah, my buddy's never been in the park, never been up in the mountains there. Like I think there is an interesting, a lot of it's like this relation to socioeconomic status.
Yes,
there's a lot of, I'm not sure what makes that true, but I think a lot of those things end up not being involved with the outdoors setting there for some reason.
A lot of those towns, and I'm not sure if it's the same in Vermont and New Hampshire, but a lot of those towns on the main Appalachian Trail, those were paper mill towns, and they were totally ravaged by deindustrialization, all the jobs going away, all of the middle class just being totally gutted. And I think as a function of that, there's like no young people there anymore. There's not even many people middle-aged. It's just anybody that remains there is just from that generation of like the 60s and 70s where like there was still some semblance of like economic stability there, and they've just stayed there in retirement. That could be it too.
Yeah,
we're gonna get to the bottom of this one day.
I mean, it's interesting because they're super small towns. I think especially those rural towns in Maine, it's like I've heard it explained as I've heard someone explain it, something about how that's still like it feels like you're stepping back in time in a lot of those towns. Like there's towns close to me where I'm from where you're like, most people wouldn't know how to operate the gas pumps because they're still so old. And
I used to pump gas. I used to pump gas in high school.
Yeah.
That's a thing in Maine still.
Yeah, for sure. I just think some of it ends up being like, yeah, that rugged individualism kind of piece where you're like, you got to take care of your own, and it's just a little hard. Life is kind of harsh. Like, could you imagine living in Millinocket year round? I mean, Caribou is up that way, and they get like, I don't know, a couple years ago, they had over a foot of snow on the ground for like 132 straight days. Like, it's kind of grim. It's cold as hell up there. It's remote. Nobody lives there. It would be tough.
For context for listeners, Katahdin is the gateway to Baxter State Park, which is where Mount Katahdin is, northern terminus of the AT. Beautiful country, but tough winters.
Yeah, I mean, it's super far north. It's just remote. Nobody lives up there. It's still, I think it's probably the only actual like frontier still, like east of the Mississippi.
Yeah,
nobody lives up there.
Yeah, the Northwoods of Maine. Well, hey, I mean, I could talk about this all day. I accidentally took us off track. Detour. I took us off track. Any other takeaways from the building of Northwoods Athletics that come to mind for you that you think the audience would be interested in hearing about? because there are folks, in Boulder and in Flagstaff that are trying to kind of pick up where like the Coconino Cowboys left off. And like we had Matt Daniels on the podcast. He's talked about this group called the Boulder Boys.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Anything coming
There are
on?
some of those. It's just been cool to see how much support from like local community it has had. Ben got stopped in a coffee shop a couple weeks ago in Boston. The guy didn't introduce himself, didn't say anything. He was just like, "Oh, Ben, like, it's been super cool that you guys are doing like a community group run. Super cool. Like, I love it." And that was like the whole interaction. The guy didn't introduce himself, didn't like say anything basically else. Ben was like, "I have no idea who this guy was," kind of thing. And maybe Ben did know him and was just out of it or something. I'm not sure. But the number of things that way has been really cool. We've had people come from who are on vacation in Vermont for 2 days from Chicago, and they've driven down from Burlington to come to the group run. We've had people come from Southern Maine to come out for a group run. Like there's so many. It's been cool to watch like the community a little bit come out of the woodwork, and because there are a lot of people who care about the stuff. So the support that way has been really cool. And I think on the flip side of that, being able to support the community through giving people maybe a space to meet other people who run, I think has been really cool. I know that there's been a bunch of people that I'm now friends with that I didn't know before this, who run locally, who are like, were kind of maybe into running, like would run occasionally, but now we're like, yeah, I want to run under 240 at Boston this year. Super cool. That's been really fun. I think there's just a lot of opportunity to keep it growing. I think that's maybe been the takeaway, is that it's just been cool.
I want to talk for a second about this journey that you've been on, let's just call it the last year, about trying to become a professional trail runner.
Yeah.
Can you talk about what the highs and the lows have been in that process so far this year when it comes to like training, racing, talking with potential sponsors, stuff like that?
So, well, probably the first real low was going to Whiteface, and it was the Classic Mountain US Champs. And as a caveat, I had no trail experience, right? Like I'd done one race like my buddy put on. To be fair, it was really sweet, but it was a mix of like mountain bike trails and dirt roads. And so it was not a good litmus test for like trail mountain ability. I ended up winning. There were good runners there. Like Luis Serafini came out. He's run 212 or 213 in the marathon, and Eric LaPuma was there. Like there were good people, but I don't know. It wasn't that same. So I went out to Whiteface basically and got destroyed. I ended up not finishing the race. It was, I think, mile 3 at 1,800 feet of climbing, and we'd already been climbing for 2 miles. And I was like, wow, I'm not at all ready to do this. I thought I was, honestly, I went in like, I hope to win this race. And that got completely shattered. And the next weekend was Loon, which was the vertical US Championship race. And I was like, I'm not doing that at all. Like, I'm terrible at this. So that was probably the first real low. Then Loon was a high, because it was like, oh, it went great. Like I got second, beat a lot of guys who were established and have had a lot of success. It's definitely been a little bit of a roller coaster, like a mix of like, I know that I have ability to do this, and then getting my head snapped back and being like, whoa, I need to actually get ready for this kind of thing.
When you think about what has been confirmed in this process versus what has been upended, like, can you talk about some of the things you thought were going to happen in this journey that ended up playing out, and they kind of confirmed your worldview about pro trail running versus like there were some things that you had ideas about and then you experienced them and it just kind of totally revolutionized how you think about things?
I mean, part of it is like, it is way more chill than at least the stuff I was doing on the track or the road. I don't know. I remember being at Loon and it was like, this is the US championship. Like, this is serious. And then nobody's even like at the start line, like seemingly right before the race. I'm like, what is going on? And then people like came, but it like to the start line, but it seemed like, yeah, it was so different that way. And then on the flip side of that, I would say I ended up racing Trofeo Nasego in Italy. And it was like so full blown. It was so legit. Like it was like the exact opposite side of the spectrum from some of the like smaller trail races I did this year. That it was like, whoa, this is really serious, and still super fun because like the whole community came out. There was like a 21.5K course that like people were everywhere on, which was really cool. Like just the after party for the whole event was humongous. Like it just ran the gamut of like every side of that spectrum of chill to just like, this is serious.
How about contract negotiations? Because I know that, you've been on a mission this year to hopefully sign with a brand next year, get a little bit more stability in your life, really make this like more and more increasingly professional. What have been the learnings in this process? And maybe we can talk about them in ways that, if there's anybody out there listening that is in a similar, I don't want to say predicament, but they're at a similar point in the journey.
Yeah.
Let's maybe we can talk about it in those terms.
So I would say, I don't know. I kind of figured that I would send out emails and like basically early on, I don't know, you and I had even talked about this, right? Like you had been like, yeah, just start blasting out emails to people. So I basically sent an email with an attached sponsor deck. Like,
send the decks.
Yep. This is who I am. These are things I've done on the track. These are things I've done so far on the trail. Blasted out emails, followed up on all of them one or two times as well. Got impressively few responses. And then most of the time, yeah, like not a lot of just no response. I was like, ooh, like I know you're not supposed to take anything personal, but like all this stuff is personal for me too. Like this is something I really care about. And so like, it does feel like a little bit of a jab, and it's not, that's not what it is, but it's really tough to not be like, oh, that's so frustrating.
How are you positioning yourself or framing yourself to the brands? Like what were your like proposed selling points?
I guess up and coming, like hopefully a lot of promise, hopefully a lot of upside. I would say basically like my second trail or mountain race or whatever, I feel like I had found a lot of success. And I feel like looking at people who've come from similar, like the track background and go to race something like Loon, I feel like usually there's a lot of struggle because it's not all applicable, the fitness from the track to that kind of thing, which is interesting. I didn't know what to expect there.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of those people have taken a while to kind of translate that. And I don't know, like I probably got lucky with it. I'm not sure, but I feel like I was able to translate pretty quickly. And so in my head, I was like, that seems to make sense. That seems to be a lot of promise. Like I have a lot of big things I want to do. I believe in myself, in the next couple of years, I want to, really do some cool things. And so then like, to be at that like kind of lofty position in my head that like, oh yeah, dude, you're not even gonna get an email back. That kind of sucked. But then like, some brands do respond and you keep talking with them and you kind of explain where you're at, what you believe in, and the conversations progress from there. It was interesting because like after then making the world team, like respond to some of these people who like hadn't responded. Like, hey, just circling back. Just wanted to let you know like where things are at. Like I'm going to be on the world team going to Thailand. And in the back of my head, knowing full well this athlete manager has nobody going on this trip that they sponsor who's a male, and maybe they have one person who's a female. And then some of those times I was getting emails back like, oh, would you, we could send you a pair of shoes to run in. And it would be like after maybe they've already told me their team is full for 2023, or like after they've already said like they can't support me. Or
there's always
like
room
that.
for dessert.
And you're like, I'm sorry, like I'm not going to run in those shoes probably. Like maybe in a couple years when we can keep talking. So that was like minor vindication. I felt like, but yeah, really it was interesting to not. I wasn't sure what to expect. I guess I was hoping I would get a lot more response than I did. And then, to be fair, things have shaken out well. Yeah.
And we can talk about that in a second. I have one question. Have you gotten a sense in this process of whether brands care more about sub-ultra or ultra athletes?
One of the common threads I feel like I was hearing was that I think people are interested in that sub-ultra stuff. I think, and this is something I've talked with you about. I know like you talked about it on the podcast, but I mean, look at it. You can't run 10 ultras in a year. You should not, at least, probably. And I think there's just something just so much sexier about running super fast down, like bombing down a mountain, and like maybe it's only an hour race, but on paper, it would seem to me that thing would be more marketable than maybe an ultra. You could easily have, it's more digestible length of time. I mean, than running for 24 hours. I know like you skew towards the interest in ultra stuff, but
yep.
I do think there's like, if it was about Instagram, you could make a much sexier, like 15-second reel of someone like sprinting down this mountain side and like slightly out of control. Maybe they fall. Like those things are going to do better than someone like having to kind of hobble down the mountain because they've been running for 23 hours. Like, like, and half the time, like people in the ultras like crap their pants and they're like throwing up. Like that stuff is brutal, but like, I don't know if it lends itself towards a like sexy video content stuff. And
I think you're totally right about the marketability.
Yeah. And so then from that point of view, it's like the athlete could race more. Hopefully if you did a good job with media stuff, I think that stuff would maybe gain more traction. And then really there's like logistically, if you're a sponsor that wants to support a race, it's way easier to make a race that's, 15K than 100 miles. So I think there's some of that stuff that I hope rounds out the scene. I don't think it has to be, ultra or sub ultra. Like, it's like, let's just round the whole thing out. Like there's room for everything to go around. It's not a zero sum game.
I think that's an incredibly interesting frame. Like maybe for any sub ultra athletes out there that are wondering, okay, I got this deck and I'm looking for some sort of narrative and a bunch of selling points for why it makes sense for a brand to partner with me. If I'm a sub ultra athlete, yeah, I could be racing upwards of 20 times a year. And that is 20 touch points with trail running audiences at a variety of races across the US, across the world. So you're getting more awareness with fans, more engagement with fans. You're doing more exciting things more often. You're worrying less about injury.
Yeah.
At least, or not, maybe not injury, but
differently
like
about
fatigue,
injury.
like OTS, stuff like that. Super compelling.
It's interesting.
But I wonder, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I just think I think there's some merit to those arguments, right? And I think you're not going to lose UTMB, right? Jim Walmsley's and Courtney, they're always going to have this huge following at UTMB, and they should. The event is super cool. Like they're like big names in that space. But it doesn't make sense to me, the US scene, like maybe not respecting or taking as seriously kind of the sub ultra stuff. And I'm not sure what that's totally like, what totally has affected that, but it is interesting.
One of the things I've always appreciated about you is you have a great sense of initiative. You're always looking to learn. You're always trying to navigate the scene, identify people that are interesting, learn from people. Can you talk about who you see as some of your contemporaries in the sport? And I know a lot of these conversations are private, but recount
Yeah.
any interesting conversations you've had with other athletes in the sport.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of people I think fit a similar mold to me who like have that collegiate track background and then are, within a year or two of me age wise. I mean, just to start naming people like Preston Cates is Nike sponsored guy. He's doing some
Yeah.
ultra distance stuff. I know Garrett Corcoran, Garrett. I've known Garrett for years now, like post race out at Stanford, we would like cool down together or something.
Sub 4, no core.
Yeah, exactly. But like, I don't know. And I feel like he's like a contemporary. I feel like I don't know all that many people, honestly. I know like I've made friends with like Brian Whitfield. He's out in Colorado. I like him. Kieran Ney, a bunch of people you just end up being like friends with. But in terms of people I actually talk with the most in terms of like maybe direction of the sport, it's probably like Eric LaPuma. Obviously, like we're friends. We talk about that stuff a lot. I talk with Patrick Heron a lot. He's training back up in Maine. He's a good guy. I think he has like a good feel of stuff. And then Jack Kensel, like you've mentioned before, I think we've brought his name up already today. We go back and forth a bunch on like, I just like how I just feel like his vision for direction of stuff is kind of, there's no right or wrong, but like I agree with it, I guess. In terms of like, these are big things. These are important, like cool things to chase. And then a little more locally, like Jordan Fields, he's got a bunch of super strong times across the Northeast. He lives locally. Good guy. I like bouncing. Him and Jack usually have fairly different perspectives, so it's interesting to bounce the same thing off the two of them.
What's Jordan's mindset? Because Jack has some pretty anti-establishment views. Yeah,
I mean, Jack tends to be much more opinionated, and Jordan tends to be, more willing to entertain both sides of an argument. And honestly,
by the way, we love Jack. Jack, I know you're listening. We love you.
Oh, I'm definitely closer to Jack. Probably Jack's leaning on a lot of those things, but I don't know. I like the way Jack thinks about a lot of stuff. I like that he's got like, he seems super dialed. He knows basically what he's going to be doing for every month in terms of what he's going for the next year, and those things are probably open to change. But there's not a ton. And this goes back to our East Coast, West Coast conversation we were having earlier in terms of like pull to the West. There's just not a ton of people who are like the frothers, I would say, like super into it, super stoked. And that's what really excites me. I think like these are huge things I'm really pumped for. This is stuff I really want to do. And I feel like there's some gravitational pull towards those things. Cause that's what I want to be more involved in. Like, I don't want to necessarily be more like, it's like the outcome does matter to me. Like, I would like to have run some pretty cool things and done some cool things by the end of this all. So I think that the people who I feel like are in like on that trajectory or interested in that, I feel like are very interesting to me.
I know that I've taken us over time here. I apologize for the running late. Maybe we got time for two more topics. I do want to close on like what your goals are for 2023 and beyond, and any news that you can share. We can talk about that too. But we had a whole list of things. Anything that we haven't covered yet that you think we should talk about before we close up?
Yeah. So I think initially, one blends into the next, but I think there's what was somewhat obvious to me was there's this fairly big culture difference in racing and like I'd never traveled before at all. All of a sudden, like I had raced well at Loon, and then all of a sudden I was on this team going to Italy, and then I was going to Thailand to race. And the coolest thing about racing over in Italy to me was like, and obviously I am not indicative of everybody because I'm like a pro or whatever. it was like they were so stoked on the elite side of the sport. I mean, I reached out to that second race I did over there, Trofeo Nasego, and they sent a black car from the first race for like a 3-hour taxi ride over to the second race. They put me up from Monday to Monday in the hotel, and like between this, they were just pumped about like seeing all these pros.
Wow.
And I had my roommate just recently went and raced the Valencia marathon.
Okay.
And he was saying, yeah, it's interesting. Like there was this guy who came up to, and he was hanging out with a couple of like the pros who had raced. And this guy from Spain comes up and's like, oh, let me buy you guys drinks. And he just wants to talk to them because they're like serious. They're pumped about the sport. And like, and the guy's asking, you know, why aren't it basically, I think the takeaway of the conversation was something along the lines of why isn't the US pumped about like running fast kind of stuff. And I do feel like there's a bit of that in the industry where it's like, oh, I mean, running fast isn't everything. And no one's claiming it's everything, but there is some amount of validity to running fast and giving something a lot of yourself. Like I probably care about the sport more than most because I give it so much energy, and I like it is one of the biggest things in my life, you know? And so I think that can almost translate into this conversation about sponsorship models and how many people, or this like leaning towards sponsoring influencers. And you're like, there's actually a podcast I listened to recently that kind of delves into this, but it's like, what is your model if Instagram's a business? In theory, it could shut down tomorrow. What is your model as a sponsor if all of the people you are investing money in have no Instagram now? You're like, who? Then you go to the races and it's like back to, well, the people who probably are the most sponsorable are the athletes who actually are like doing the thing well. It's interesting the way things have gone that way. And like there should be room for both. They're like, obviously if you're super locally involved and it doesn't, being better isn't everything, and it certainly doesn't make you a better person in any way, but for the most part it would seem to me that there is value from a sponsor's perspective in working with people who are like really damn good at the thing.
One thing, and I just pulled this tweet up because when you mentioned Valencia and the questioning about, you know, times and speed, Michael Johnson, you know, Olympian back in the 90s, great sprinter, had this tweet. I put it in the newsletter 2 weeks ago. He says, is track the only sport where as fans, our biggest excitement comes from fast times or even the prospect of them? In most sport, that's the equivalent of a stat, which is a byproduct of competition.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on like that delineation between times and just like purely wanting to beat someone else, like to finish, you know, on the podium, stuff like that?
Yeah, it's super interesting because I think obviously there's a whole lot of truth there in terms of track and road performances, but that is part of the sport that I was not into and I couldn't make my head click with, where it's like just racing to do time trials and like that's not what I'm into. Like I love just the more broken down version of it, which is just like running hard and racing. And like,
yeah,
I think that's why trail is cool, because there will be a course record, but it's relative to the course. And then even day to day, like obviously Western States is a great example. No one's going to run the Western States record if it's super, super hot. And if they do, like, that's obviously wild. But that's why the trail stuff I think is so cool, because it's more about the competition head to head. And maybe Jack listening over there is shaking his head because all he wants to do is FKTs and he's afraid to race. But, you know, maybe he should race.
Dan, this has been an awesome conversation. I'm sure we'll do many more of these in the history of single track. for this particular one, though, got one last question for you, and it revolves around, as I mentioned, goals and schedule for 2023. So what do you have lined up? Do you have everything settled? Like, where's your mind at for next year?
No, open to tips. I don't know. Waiting to see more of the world kind of schedule. Like, I don't think Golden Trail has released theirs. Hoping to see WMRA's schedule, kind of bounce around that. I am definitely pointing towards trying to make the world team in Austria. The another hint for the East Coast is, I believe, the Vertical and Classic Championship is out here at Mount Sunapee.
Yep.
Which is an interesting venue, but not the biggest mountain on earth. So yeah, that should be end of April, the 29th and the 30th, and then Worlds in Austria is June 6th to the 10th. I'd like to do that. Then, I'd love to do Broken Arrow, which is only like 10 days later. I think that's like the 17th or so of June. Yeah, bunch of stuff I'd like to do. I'd like to go on a bit of a European tour next summer. And then I have some FKT aspirations that I think I'm going to keep in the bag for a little while. I might tell you off camera, but yeah, excited about a lot of that stuff. And then right now I'm overhauling the training and seeing if I can't prepare myself to actually be able to race for like 1 to 3 hours.
Does the Presidential Traverse FKT interest you at all up in the Whites?
Of course, Jack has it. It's 3:38. It'd be great to go over there.
I should have asked you this, or I should have asked Jack, honestly, but I'm on the FKT site now, and it looks like Jack has the southbound in 3:38 and change, and then Ben Thompson has the northbound in 3:32, but it's flagged. Do you have any insight on that?
It's a winter.
Gotcha.
Run. So
gotcha.
Basically, Finn, but I think people might not. It's an 18-mile route. It's like 9,000 feet of climbing or something, 8,500. And it's just so technical that even despite the winter being like obviously super rough up there, it's much faster in the winter because it's so technical that everything is just filled in and it becomes a highway. So no shade thrown to Ben Thompson, but
gotcha.
I think Jack's time is probably a little stronger.
Well, Dan, as I said, great chatting. Thanks for the great conversation, the great ideas, the great perspective. I'm sure there's a lot of folks listening that will have a bunch of nuggets to take away from this one. We're recording this in mid-December, about a week before Christmas. I'm hoping to release this in maybe around the new year. So hopefully this is good New Year's fodder for the listeners. Thanks so much.
Great. Thanks a lot, Finn.